Welcome, everyone. I'm Penny Lewis, the Executive Director of the Ecological Landscape Alliance, and I'll be the moderator for this evening's webinar, The Chickadee Guide to Gardening, Why Native Plants Matter to Songbirds and the Food They Eat. This is part of the Focus on Sustainability webinar series developed by a group of organizations known regionally for their quality ecological education. By collaborating on these webinars, we expand the reach of our regional programs across the country. In case you're not familiar with our organizations, they're largely nonprofit and volunteer groups in the United States. The regional groups are the Ecological Landscape Alliance, the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council, Deep Roots Kansas City, and Rescape California. And now I'd like to introduce our presenter, Dr. Desiree Narango. Dr. Narango is a postdoctoral researcher at City University of New York and a visiting researcher at University of Massachusetts Amherst. Her research interests include urban and suburban ecology, plant-animal interactions, and community-driven science, to name a few. Dr. Narango has a PhD in entomology and wildlife ecology, as well as degrees in natural resources and environmental biology. Welcome, Dr. Narango.
Thank you for that introduction, Penny. And thank you everyone who's listening in here today. Okay. So like Penny said, I'm going to be talking to you today about native plants and why they matter, not just to songbirds, but for the pollinators that they eat. And I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story about what this black and white bird taught me about gardening. But before I get started, I just want to kind of introduce who I am and who I am as a researcher. So I like to call myself an interaction ecologist. So I study how plants and animals interact with each other, with their environment, and ultimately with the people who are the ones that are driving the habitat changes for them. And most of my work occurs in human-dominated systems. So I work in urban forests, I work in residential yards, and I also do a little bit in agriculture as well. And most of my work has so far taken place in urban areas. And this is important because the world is becoming increasingly urbanized, which is drastically changing habitat quality. But most importantly, the majority of people are now living in urban and suburban residential areas as well. And this is where their primary interactions with nature and wildlife are occurring. But I see these urban areas as conservation opportunities. And that's because when we think about a city, it's not just one thing. There's lots of different types of green spaces, from cemeteries to community gardens, riparian zones, green roofs, botanical gardens. All of these places have conservation potential. But they're also a real conservation challenge because each one of these different green spaces is being managed by different people according to their own personal needs and values. And so our real grand challenge as ecologists and conservationists and as members of the global public is to really understand how we can share the places that we live, work, and play with biodiversity while simultaneously encouraging and supporting the people that live there as well. And so I was really lucky that when I started my PhD work, I got to team up with two advisors who were also really interested in how landscaping decisions might affect biodiversity. And so I worked with Dr. Doug Tallamy, who's an entomologist at the University of Delaware. And I also worked with Dr. Pete Vera, who is an ornithologist at the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center. And then I came in as a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed PhD student who was a bit of a plant nerd. And together we started to ask these questions about how we can improve these urban areas for wildlife. And one of the questions that we chose to tackle is whether to plant native or non-native plant species. And this is one of the most major management decisions that homeowners can make in terms of what sort of plants to have in their yard, whether to plant native species or evolutionary novel non-natives. Historically, most plant choices were made based on how pretty a plant is or how easy it is to maintain. But increasingly, there's interest in prioritizing plants that support both ecosystem services and local biodiversity. But this question is definitely not trivial. Horticulture is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and it is the primary introduction for most of our non-native plants. And in urban areas in particular, non-native plants are very common. Habitat is extremely limited, and habitat management is in the hands of the private homeowner. And so in order to really improve these areas for biodiversity, we need to ask the question for them, are non-native plants the ecological equivalent of native species? But the more that I dive into this question, I've been starting to think about this in sort of a different way, not just in black and white terms of native and non-native, but in terms of productivity. So in other words, thinking about how can we arm ourselves with the data that we need in order to strategically manage for productive plant species that have the highest value for wildlife habitat. And so to get started today, I'm going to provide you some evidence for why plant identity might matter, first from the perspective of our lovely pollinators. So I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the monarch butterfly, who feeds exclusively on milkweed plants. But what a lot of folks don't know is that the majority of our plant-eating insects are specialists to some degree. And so what that means is that our butterflies, when they're caterpillars, have to feed on plants. And they have evolved, or they've adapted over evolutionary time to feed on just particular host plants because they've adapted to the chemical compounds that are in those plants, the phenological timing, as well as the structural components of these plants as well. And so one of my favorite examples is the double-toothed prominent, which feeds exclusively on elm. You can see that here. And so they can overcome the chemicals that are in the elm, but they also blend in really nicely with the double-toothed structure that you see on elm plants so that they can avoid predation as well. And so just to share a few examples of this, we see specialization in all sorts of forms. Here is the juniper hairstreak, a lovely green butterfly. It goes to lots of different flowers when it's in its adult form, but most of its life is spent as a caterpillar feeding on plants. And the only plant that it feeds on the eastern United States is Juniperus virginiana, the red cedar. So you can't have juniper hairstreak unless you have the red cedar. Here we have spicebush swallowtail. Entomologists are really convenient when they're naming their insects, and they give them common names. They often give them names that correspond with the plants that they need. And so, as you might expect, the spicebush swallowtail feeds on spicebush plants. But they can also feed on some other plants as well. And so up here in Massachusetts, the plant that I find spicebush swallowtail on the most are sassafras. So if you want to have spicebush swallowtail, you got to have spicebush or sassafras. Next, we have the pearl crescent, a lovely orange and black butterfly. The caterpillar is pretty drab, but the butterfly is beautiful. They feed on the aster genus, which, if you know your plants, asters are incredibly diverse. So there's a lot of different choices to choose from if you want to attract pearl crescents to your yard. Next, we have the eastern tiger swallowtail, a really common, large, beautiful butterfly in the eastern United States. They're what entomologists call a generalist species. So they've actually been recorded on lots of different host plants in the literature, but they also exhibit localized specialization as well. So up here where I am in Massachusetts, we find eastern tiger swallowtails mostly on cherry trees. But if I travel south to Delaware, where I did my PhD, we find them a lot of times on our tulip trees. And if I go even further south to Florida, they feed almost exclusively on sweet bay magnolia. So they're really tuned in to the particular host plants that are abundant in their, where the population is located. It's not just our butterflies that specialize on plants, our lovely moths do too. This is the rosy maple moth, which is, as you would expect, they feed on maple trees. But what we find is when we look at where the caterpillars are, they're almost overwhelmingly on sugar maple, which is just one species of all the different maples that are out there. In case you were thinking that the pretty moth that I just showed you was a one-off, here's where I pitch my enthusiasm for moth diversity. And these are all different species that I took pictures of in my own backyard. And so I just really want to emphasize that moths are amazing and wonderful in their own right. And they're really important pollinators as well, even if we only see them at night. But in order to have that incredible moth diversity, we have to support their caterpillars as well. And so we have to provide the host plants that those caterpillars need to feed on in order to grow into these beautiful species. So next I have a little bit of a thought exercise for you. So I'm up here in Massachusetts, and I want you to put a number in your head of how many caterpillar species do you think that there are in the state of Massachusetts? Just take a second, get a number, maybe low. Whatever number you had, it was probably too low, because the answer is that there's at least 2,249 different caterpillar species in this state. And there's thousands and thousands in all the other states across the United States as well. And so I looked in our data to see just how many of these caterpillar species feed on different plants. And I found that in this state, 30% of them only feed on one plant, just one genus out of all of the different genera that are out there. 70% of these caterpillar species are only feeding on less than 5 plants, which you might think, well, hey, that's pretty good. Like 5 plants is a lot, you know, that's a lot of different plants to choose from. But if you think about all the different genera that are out there, there's thousands and thousands of different genera for each state, plus all the introduced species, plus all the cultivars, plus all the hybrids. It really, if you think about it, is just a fraction of the plant diversity that is out there, less than 0.001%. And so it comes as no surprise that when we look at the host plant literature, so this is entomologists recording how many caterpillar species they see on different plants, we see that native plants overwhelmingly support more caterpillar diversity compared to non-natives. And this is especially true for our woody ornamental species. Woody species are things like trees and shrubs. And again, we see in the literature that when people compare native to non-natives, we see lower herbivore diversity overall, fewer caterpillar species, and especially we see fewer of these specialist species on the non-native plants, the ones that are feeding on the fewest number of plants overall. And these numbers can be really drastic. So here, these are numbers for Massachusetts. We have up on the top end, we have our real heavy hitters like oak supporting 477 different species of caterpillar, cherry supporting 415, willows at 406. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have a lot of really unproductive non-native species. So here in New England, lilacs are super popular. That plant supports 26 caterpillar species, which actually for a non-native is pretty darn good. Then we have things like barberry, an invasive plant, at 13, ginkgo at 6, ailanthus, the tree of heaven, is at 4, and then a slew of other non-native species like zelkova and nandina, where no caterpillar species has ever been recorded on that plant. The same is true for our perennials and annuals. So they support fewer caterpillars than the woody species, but we still see these drastic differences. Goldenrod is supporting 132 caterpillar species, clover 118, asters 108. And then on the other end, we've got our very popular garden perennials and annuals like zinnia 9, daffodil 1, hyacinth 0. So I'm talking a lot about caterpillars that feed specifically on their host plants, but what about the other pollinators that are out there? Are they plant specialists? And the answer is yes. Flower flies are a type of fly that is a mimic of bees and wasps. They are incredibly important pollinators, and they will choose specific plants and specific plants at certain times of the year in order to feed their young. They're very picky about the particular plants that they want to use. We also have beetles, which have incredible, beautiful diversity in their own right, and many of them will choose particular plants when they're feeding as an adult and when they're a caterpillar. And when they're a larva, excuse me. They can be really specialized to particular plants as well. But something that I recently learned that a lot of people don't realize is that our lovely bees can be pollen specialists as well. In fact, in the eastern United States, more than 30% of our native bees are specialists. So that turns out to be about 120 specialist species. That means that these bees have adapted to come out during their flights when the plants that they need their pollen are in flower. So for the Adrena fragilis, the fragile dogwood bee, this bee is highly specialized to only feed dogwood pollen to their young. So you can't have the Adrena fragilis unless you have dogwood on your property. And so I went and looked at the bee literature to count up and see, like, are there some plants that are supporting the majority of the bees? And it turns out that there's a lot of plants that have one specialist bee species to one plant. There's a lot of that going on. But there are some plants that turn out to be those heavy hitters again. And so the ones I want to point out are the willows that support 14 specialist bee species, dogwood at 4, hollies at 2. And then for our perennials, we have sunflowers, goldenrods, blueberries, and asters. These are all supporting 10 to 14 specialist bees apiece. The reason that I want to emphasize this is because I recognize that there's a lot of non-native plants that are really great pollinator attractors as well. But it turns out that when we look at the bees that are really having population declines, especially in urban areas, we see that the bees that are declining are the ones that are the pollen specialists. And those are the ones that are most susceptible to anthropogenic threats. And so I emphasize that if you plant flowers for the specialists, you're going to get those generalist species too. Okay, so I've been talking a lot about insects, but you might be thinking, well, I don't care about insects. I don't want them on my plants. That's not important to me. So now I'm going to provide you some evidence for why plant identity might matter from the perspective of a bird. And the reason for that is that birds eat insects. They are incredibly important for our terrestrial birds. In fact, over 90% of our terrestrial birds rely on insects at least in some point in the annual cycle. And so I looked in the literature just to see just how many that is. And it turns out that over 440 different North American bird species are feeding on insects. And the reason for this is that insects are highly nutritious for growing young baby birds, especially caterpillars. We see that caterpillars are consistently preferred by bird species because they have high protein, which is great for growing bones and feathers. They have high calories, which make them really efficient food packets. And they also have high carotenoids from the plants, which is important for immune function and for creating beautiful, amazing coloration. And so this reminds me of a quote by Dr. Thomas Lovejoy that says, if you take care of birds, you take care of most of the environmental problems in the world. And I think this is an incredibly true quote because birds are an indicator species of environmental health. And when you have healthy bird populations, you tend to have healthy soil, healthy trees, and healthy water. But birds are really important because they provide services for us too. We have many species that are important pollinators. We have species that are important for pest control, so they keep our trees and our shrubs nice and healthy. We have species that serve as important transporters of seeds and nutrients, and so they are actually the best habitat restoration managers in the world by transporting all of these great seeds and creating new forests for us. But I think one of the things that's most important about birds is that they have incredible human social value and cultural value as well. And I mean, who doesn't like to go outside in the morning with a cup of tea or a cup of coffee and just listen to bird song? It's just incredibly soothing. And we actually see that when there's more bird diversity, people are happier and they have better psychological well-being. If you are working in ecological landscaping, you may have heard of the book Bringing Nature Home, which is a book written by my advisor, Doug Tallamy. And in that book, he talked about his findings that native plants were better for bugs. And most of his research has shown this again and again. And so he posited in this book that if native plants are better for bugs, and bugs are important for birds, the native plants must be better for birds and better for food webs. But the truth is that when Doug wrote this book, he had never tested that before. And we actually didn't have explicit data to show that native plants are better for birds. And so that's where I came in. And so when I worked on my PhD, I worked on a project called Neighborhood Nestwatch, which is a citizen science program through the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center in Washington, D.C. And what we do in this program is we go into people's yards so that we can study the effects of urbanization on breeding birds, but we also engage people with the process of science as well. And so for my PhD, I asked two separate questions with similar questions, but with different implications. So first, an ecological question of how do non-native plants affect food webs, but also a practical question for the homeowners themselves, which is how should I garden and what sort of plants should I include if I want to create bird habitat? And this project was funded by the National Science Foundation. So the story I'm going to tell you about now is the story of the Carolina chickadee, my focal species. And what I learned halfway through my dissertation was that the indigenous people whose land we occupy used to call the Carolina chickadee the bird of truth and the bringer of good fortune. And so I found it really serendipitous that when I came to do my PhD, I was using the chickadee as my bird of truth to understand how native and non-native plants were impacting food webs. But they're really important species because they are readily used urban areas, but they're also primarily insectivorous. In fact, over 95% of their diet are insects like caterpillars, spiders, and leafhoppers. So for each one of our sites, we set up these chickadee boxes. You can see this tube on the right-hand side. We put them up to attract the birds to nest, and then we ask the homeowners to monitor those nest boxes over the season. But we also recognize that birds aren't limited to a single yard. So our study site also included a 50-meter radius around that nest box where we searched the area so that we can ensure that the birds were we could be sure that the birds were nesting either in the yard or in the neighboring area or in a natural tree cavity. But birds are not cooperative. And so they often do some really funny things, like this pair that nested in a newspaper slot for 3 years in a row, and they were successful every year. And so I think this is a really great example of how if the resources are there for them, the birds will find a way. So for each one of these sites, we also conducted systematic insect counts so that we could quantify the abundance of food that was available for these birds. And we also did random plots so that we could sample, identify, and measure the plant community as well. And so we measured and identified every woody tree and shrub that we found in our different plots. This is the part of the talk where I define what I mean by native and non-native, because that can mean different things depending on who you talk to. And for the purposes of this study, we actually used a pretty liberal definition of native. We said that something was native if it had a distribution that included the eastern United States. And so anything outside of that, either from Japan or Europe or Australia or the Western United States, that was considered non-native. So first, was there variation in our sites? Fortunately, there was. In fact, it was hyper diverse. We found that at the end of our study, we recorded over 350 different woody plant species from over 74 different families, and that's not including cultivars and all sorts of other variation. In general, we had about 29 woody plant species per site, but it did vary a lot. But most importantly, we found lots of difference in non-native biomass, which is what we're mostly interested in. And we found that there was from less than 1% non-native up to 99% non-native plant biomass. So what did these places look like? Were they covered with nasty invasive plants that were totally choking out the ecosystem and going crazy? The answer is no, that's not what these sites look like at all. These sites are highly managed, highly cultivated landscapes where all of the plants that we find in these systems are specifically planted by the homeowner or the developer or are chosen to be retained. And so what I want to emphasize here is that the plants that we're studying in these systems have already gone through the filter of what people think are aesthetically pleasing and valuable in the landscape. So for our first question, do native trees have more food for birds? And the answer is yes, overwhelmingly so. We found that consistently native trees had much higher caterpillar biomass compared to the non-natives. We also found that native trees had more of other arthropods as well, like spiders and ants and beetles and all sorts of different things. But the insects where we found more on our non-native species were things like leafhoppers, scale insects, and aphids, which tend to be invasive insects in their own right, but also tend to be those horticultural pests that people don't really want on their plants anyway. And so we were finding them more on our non-native species. But if you know plants, you know that there's nuance. And so what I did was go back to that literature from the entomologists where they counted up different caterpillar species. And I found that the numbers of caterpillars that we find in the field is actually strongly positively related to the number of caterpillar species that are known to be on that plant. And we see the same relationship for both native and non-native plants, except that the native plants tend to have more caterpillars than the non-natives. And this is really important for these congeneric species. So these are non-native plants that are related to our native species. For example, black cherry is a native to the eastern United States, whereas Kwanzan cherry is a Japanese non-native species. And so hypothetically, because they're in the same genus, these Kwanzan cherries should have the same caterpillars as the black cherries. But what we find in the field is that these non-native related species tend to have about 40% fewer caterpillar abundance and about half the diversity. So if you have a choice, choosing a non-native congener is better, but they're not the ecological equivalent of the native species that are being replaced. Now I'm going to switch gears for a little bit because a lot of folks tend to ask about the cultivar question. So these are native species that are chosen to be propagated for different traits that people find aesthetically pleasing. And so a lot of folks want to know, do cultivars have the same ecological value as the parent species? And so we looked at a lot of different traits like leaf variegation, growth habit, disease resistant, and enhanced fruiting to see if they had different caterpillar communities or abundance. And what we found is that it depends on the trait. It was not clear relationships. And the only trait where we saw clear relationships was in these red-leafed cultivars. And they consistently supported lower diversity, lower abundance, and were not preferred by caterpillars. And that makes sense because these red leaves have a lot of those anthocyanins that are chemical compounds that deter feeding. And so from a plant caterpillar perspective, red leaf cultivars do have an effect. But I want to emphasize that there's not a lot of data on cultivars out there. So don't let this, necessarily change your habits just yet. But what I can assure you is that there's a lot of great researchers that are looking at this question right now, especially in terms of how decreases in genetic diversity might impact insect biodiversity. Okay, for our next question is, do the chickadees prefer native trees? If native trees have more food, do the chickadees recognize that? And to answer that question, we let the chickadees tell us what trees they like. We use a method called color banding, where we actually capture these birds so that we can apply these color bands to their legs. It's a safe procedure that I've been trained on and certified through USGS. But what this allows us to do is to identify the individual birds without catching them again. So I can go out in the field and I can say, hey, this is blue yellow, this is the male, he's from the nest that I'm following that has 6 nestlings, and now I can follow him around and see what plants that he's choosing in the neighborhood. And so when we follow the birds around, we get really cool data. We get to see that this particular bird, blue yellow, his nest here is where the star is, and he was feeding a lot in black cherry that the homeowner actually planted in her yard. But he also fed on a sweet gum that was planted on the road and some willow oak street trees. He also went to the neighbor's yard to feed on someone's arrowwood viburnum, and he went across the neighborhood to find a black walnut that somebody had seeded or let itself seed in their yard. But what you notice from these maps is that there's a lot of the neighborhood that the chickadees are not using at all. And so the question is, what are they avoiding in that neighborhood? And the answer is they're avoiding non-native plants. We found that for all of the territories that we studied, the chickadees were overwhelmingly preferring native species. In fact, for 99% of the territories we studied, they preferred native plants over non-natives. But again, there's nuance. And so here, I plugged in the caterpillar species from the literature record, and I see this beautiful, linear, positive relationship between caterpillar species and how much birds are preferring them. We see that there is a positive relationship with non-natives, except that the relationship is much weaker and the preferences are much lower for non-natives. But again, I want to emphasize that most of the non-natives are here at this, the non-native genera are here in the lower end of the spectrum because they don't support any caterpillars. So they're basically functioning as ornamental statues in the landscape. And here, the non-native relatives, the birds prefer them a little bit more, but again, they're just not serving the same ecological function as the native species. But what's really cool here is that the number of caterpillar species is predicting bird preference as well. One thing that I thought was really interesting is that when we were following these birds around, it was spring migration. And so the same trees that our birds were choosing to forage in were also being covered by these amazing, beautiful migratory birds that were making their journeys north. In fact, by the end of the study, we documented over 50 species of migratory birds that were using residential yards as stopover habitat, and we recorded over 20 different species of warbler. And so these are birds that don't necessarily breed in residential yards during the spring and summer, but they are using these habitats to make their journeys. And these birds are making incredible journeys. They're breeding in the boreal forest of Canada. They're migrating thousands and thousands of miles down to the Amazon rainforest in South America. And along the way, they need to stop in order to find food and refuel. And they don't know where they're going. So they end up in people's yards. And so for a lot of people, they had never heard of the chestnut-sided warbler, which is the one that you see here. And they didn't really think about that bird when they were thinking about their habitat. But it turns out that even though this bird might only be using your yard for 3 days out of the year, it could arguably be some of the most important days in this little bird's life if it can't find the food it needs to keep on going. Okay, so the take-home message for this first part here is that We found that overwhelmingly non-native trees have less caterpillars and insect food for birds to feed on. Accordingly, we found that chickadees strongly prefer native trees for foraging. But I think the most important thing that we showed with this research is that caterpillar richness can be kind of a proxy for bird habitat. And so we're suggesting that if you're making relative comparisons between different tree species, that you might be able to use these numbers to help you make your decision. And you can find these numbers. Here, this is a website called the Native Plant Finder. It's by the National Wildlife Federation and the U.S. Forest Service. And you can plug in your zip code and you can get lists of plant species for your area and find out what number of caterpillars can be found on different plants. This is important because as gardeners and landscapers, you have lots of different things that are limiting what plants you can have, from shade to soil and what you think is pretty. And so once you've narrowed it down to plants that will work in your landscape, now you can use this number to help you choose the ones that will be the most beneficial for bird habitat. You can also do backtracking searches if you're interested in particular butterflies or moths, so you can look up to see what host plants you would need in order to attract them to breed. Okay, so if you've seen Doug give a talk before, you may have seen this. The question is, how many caterpillars do you think it takes to make a nest of chickadees? It's another thought exercise. Get a number in your head. The answer is lots. In fact, an ornithologist in the 60s actually counted up how many caterpillars a nest of chickadees was bringing per day, and he found that they were bringing between 300 to 500 caterpillars per day. And chickadees feed their young for 16 days before those nestlings fledge and leave the nest. So that's a lot of caterpillars. And that's just for one chickadee nest. And that's one bird that weighs 10 grams, 10 pennies sitting in your hand. So think about how many caterpillars does it take to raise a cardinal or a blue jay or a red-bellied woodpecker? That's a lot of caterpillars that we need in the landscape. So the next question is, what if they can't find that many? In other words, are there consequences when non-native plants are abundant? And the results of this study were recently published last year in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. So how do we answer this question? Well, we have to monitor populations. And in order to do that, we have to collect a lot of different pieces of data. So we have to get information about their reproduction. So how many eggs are they laying? How many young are they producing? We have to get a sense for how the adults are surviving from year to year. So they come back to the same places if they survive. So what's the probability that our red-yellow bird here is coming back to the same location and surviving? We also need to get a sense for juvenile survival. So if we're after our baby birds leave the nest, what is the probability that they're going to survive long enough to get a territory of their own and produce their own young? And we can use all of those pieces of data and put that together to get a sense for what is the population growth trajectory of these chickadees. And without getting into the nitty-gritty of the statistics, I can tell you our results were that when we compared yards that were landscaped with native plants, the yards that had high non-native plant biomass tend to have chickadees that were less likely to occupy. So that means they were just less likely to even have a chickadee. Chickadees were just not there. If the chickadees were there, they were less likely to breed. If those chickadees did breed, they laid fewer eggs. Not a lot fewer, but modestly fewer eggs. If they laid eggs, those nests were less likely to survive. And if they survived to fledge at least one young, they were fledging fewer young overall. Where we didn't see any differences was in adult survival, which makes sense. If you know this bird, they winter in the eastern United States. They can deal with our harsh winters. And the thing that neighborhoods tend to have is a lot of birdseed. And so after they're finished breeding, they switch to that birdseed. And so if there's not a lot of insect food, it really doesn't matter much because there's a lot of seed to eat as well. So when we plug all of that different information and compound reproduction, we find that a drastic reduction in the number of young that were fledged per territory as non-native plant biomass increases. It goes down to an estimate of near zero as we get to the highest ends of the spectrum. For juvenile survival, so this is after the birds have left the nest, we found that there wasn't a lot of differences because the birds were now flexible to choose any plants that they wanted to go to. So here, the white circle is where we actually collected our plant data, and you can see that they didn't really use the forests around the areas at all. They only were using these residential landscapes, and they had the flexibility to go to whatever plants that were producing lots of insect food. And so that meant they were actually going to some really interesting places. For example, going to this gas station here. And so as you might imagine, it's pretty funny to talk to the gas station owner about why we're sitting here with binoculars looking at their trees. And the reason for that is because there were lots of willow oaks that were planted around this Sunoco. So if the trees are there, the birds will really use them. So with all this information that we have, we want to get a sense for how well these birds are replacing themselves. So this dotted line at 0 is replacement. Birds are producing enough young in order to replace the young that are dying each year. And so an ideal chickadee population will fluctuate around that dotted line. And so when we take adult survival, juvenile survival, and our reproduction, we plug it all together into a population growth model, we see that as non-native plant biomass increases, population growth strongly declines. In fact, our mean population growth only overlaps 0 when non-native plants are less than 10% of the plant biomass. But because we recognize that there's variation from site to site and from year to year, so we want to run this population growth model again and again so we can get a sense for that variation. And that's what that gray bar is right there. And so what we see is that where this gray bar stops overlapping replacement is at 30% non-native plant biomass. And so this suggests to us that we can use this number as a potential threshold that people can aim for in order to improve their habitats or improve their yards for bird habitat. So when you have more than 30% non-native plant biomass, the chickadees are virtually incapable of reproducing enough young to sustain the population. But once you get lower than that, then they have the possibility of doing that. Of course, the chickadees are pretty flexible, and we have some more sensitive insectivorous species. And so if we want to provide habitat for them as well, we're going to have to shoot lower than 30%. But at least this is serving a bit of a cutoff for people to aim for. I only have a couple more minutes left, so if you have some questions that you want to think about and submit, now would probably be the time to do that. So when I saw this result, I was actually really encouraged. And the reason for that is that the average non-native plant biomass in DC is only about 55%. And so if you think about it, it's really just a gentle nudge in the right direction towards improving these areas for bird habitat. And it also suggests to me that people can really make a difference just by planting a few native plants, getting rid of some of those invasive non-native species, and that might be just enough for those birds to reach that cutoff to be able to produce more young. And that's important because there are some non-native species that people have cultural value for. My grandmother used to love Japanese maples. And so it suggests to me that it's okay for you to have a few non-native but non-invasive species in your landscape as long as you begin to prioritize native plants such that they make up at least 70% of the plant biomass. Of course, we've done plant sampling in other locations, and we see that for our new suburban developments, especially agricultural farmland that's being developed into residential areas, and our non-residential areas like office buildings, those areas can be 80 and 90% non-native plant biomass. And so in order to really improve these areas for bird habitat, that's going to require a much more dramatic difference in the change in our landscaping habits and in our values as well. Okay, so the take-home message for this part is we found that chickadees in yards that occupied yards with high non-native plant biomass, they had lower nesting occupancy, and so they were less likely to even nest. And that was actually our strongest result. So it does show to us that the chickadees are able to recognize low quality habitat most of the time. But some birds were nesting. And when they do nest in areas with high non-native plants, they are experiencing lower reproductive success. And the declines that we saw in reproductive success were enough to put those birds over the edge so that they had reduced population growth and were not able to actually reach replacement for the population. So if we want to have sustainable populations of chickadees in our urban and suburban landscapes, we have to prioritize at least 70% native plant biomass. Okay, so to conclude here today, I hope that I've given you evidence that if we want to support insect and bird biodiversity, land managers, homeowners, restoration folks, we really need to plant and retain and prioritize not just native plant species, but the ones that are insect producing in order to create high quality bird habitat. But in the end, you know, we really got informative results. But I think that what's most important, what we demonstrated, is that your yard and your garden really matters. And that the simple choices that you make in your landscaping can have really far-reaching implications for supporting biodiversity in these areas. And then I hope that I've emphasized to you today that by planting native plants, we can not just create beautiful gardens, but we can prioritize ecological interactions to create functional and beautiful habitat that provides services for people as well as for wildlife as well. So with that, I'm going to end my talk here today. Again, my name is Desiree Narango. If you have any questions that you'd like to send me, you can email me at dnarango@gmail.com. I'm also really active on Twitter, so you can tweet me anytime at DLNarango. I like to use the hashtag Plants for Wildlife. All of the information that I presented to you today and all of the papers that we published are available for free on my website, and you can go to the website DesireeLNarango.com to get them. And finally, the native plant finder that I spoke about today that has that caterpillar richness values, the website is here at the bottom. So I encourage you to check that out and see if it might be useful for you. So with that, I want to say thank you for your attention, and I'll take any questions that you have.
Excellent. That was wonderful. We do have several questions, Dr. Narango.
Great.
The first is, did summer bird feeders affect nest success with the chickadees that you studied?
Oh, that's a great question. So I actually do get that question a lot, and wondering if bird feeders were impacting some of our results. And I can assure you that it's not. And the reason for this is because all of our sites had bird feeders. And what we found, so to be a part of the project, we required people to not feed insect food. So they couldn't feed mealworms, and they were not allowed to feed crickets or waxworms or anything. And if we found neighbors feeding that, we dropped the site out of the study. But what we found when we were following our color-banded individuals around is that even though there were birds going to the bird feeders, the ones that were going were not actually the ones that were breeding. So we're following individuals, so we know like who is actually the male and female for this nest. And they tend to avoid the feeders when they're breeding, and then after they're finished producing young, then they start feeding on the seed. And so I think that's enough support that the presence of birdseed is likely not impacting our results in any way. If anything, it probably allowed places that have non-native plants to be more likely to have chickadee.
Excellent. The next question, are common lawn violets considered native, and are they among plants that support wildlife?
Oh, that's a great question. So, so my caveat is that I know woody plants much more than I know our herbaceous plants. But there are violets that can spring up in lawns that are native. There also are some non-native ones that can spring up as well. And I don't remember the scientific name off the top of my head, but there are some native species that will occur spontaneously. And they're also really important for some of our butterfly species, like our fritillaries. So many of the fritillary butterflies, they use violets as their host plants all the time. And you can't have those fritillary butterflies unless you have those violets in your lawn. And by encouraging those spontaneous lawn flowers, you can also, support caterpillars, but also bee food resources as well.
Okay, that's good information. The next question is, what prunus varieties were supporting the 415 species that you mentioned?
Sure. So prunus is the cherries, and so the native cherries for the Mid-Atlantic are Prunus serotina, the black cherry, I think Prunus virginiana, the choke cherry. Those are the primary native ones. We also have Carolina cherry laurel, and then there's a whole, there's lots of non-native cherries as well. So the caveat of that host plant literature is that most of that data is collected on native plants. And so the entomologists weren't studying non-natives back in the day because they weren't supporting insects, so why would they study them? And so so that's why I emphasize that hypothetically our non-native cherries should have 450 species, but in actuality, they don't. And so the ones, so I'm not saying that we actually counted 450, it's that 450 have been recorded as using that plant over the last 100 years. But we do see that our native species have about double the number of species that those non-native cherries do.
Okay. The number of species supported by perennials that you mentioned was considerably lower than those supported by tree and shrub species. Are there perennial plant combinations that are more effective than individual perennial species?
Ooh, that's a really good question. So in general, perennials do support fewer caterpillars. And if you watch birds, you might not be surprised by that because most of the time they're feeding in the woody plants. They're not, we have goldfinches that go to our coneflowers and things, but a lot of times they're not really foraging in flowers as much as they are in trees. Does improving different combinations, would that improve diversity? I haven't studied that myself, but I would be pretty confident to say that when you increase diversity, you're going to be increasing, if you're increasing plant diversity, you're going to be increasing diversity overall. And that's just because we have a higher probability of attracting not just generalist species, but specialist species as well. So you always want to go for more diversity. But I think also from an aesthetic point of view and an actual landscaping point of view, I recently heard a talk from a woman named Claudia West, who is a landscaper in the Philadelphia area. And she gave a really great example of how when you combine different plant species that complement each other, they will keep each other in check. And they'll also grow in a more synergistic and complementary way. And so if you get a chance, I would check out her website, Google Claudia West. I think she has a lot of really cool points to make about how you can prioritize community diversity.
Very good. In addition to plant selections, are there other habitat features required or that you looked at in terms of things like water, et cetera, in the sites that you studied?
Sure. So we did not consider water or shelter or things like that for this species because we had a sense from the literature that the primary things that they're limited by are food and as well as the availability of cavities, and that's cavities to nest in. And so that's why we put up the nest boxes so that we could ensure that they had at least one place to nest, right? You know, there's other resources that are important for birds. So creating like brush habitat for shelter can attract birds, and water features can attract birds. And I haven't talked at all about fruit, and we know that birds will prioritize certain plant species for fruit as well. And so, you know, I hope I made the case that insects are a very important component of bird population and habitat quality. But that's not to say that these other features aren't important either. And so a really great yard that supports bird habitat has not just food, but shelter, water, keeping cats inside, you know, all of those features that will promote healthy bird populations. No pesticides, etc.
Excellent. In researching the cultivars, you mentioned avoidance of red foliage. Did you also look at any of the variegated foliage and see how that was affecting frequency of use?
Yes, variegation was one of the traits that we considered. And so we did a slew of different comparisons. And for variegation, in some of our comparisons, we found that caterpillars were actually more abundant on variegated plants than they were on the straight species, which is really interesting because, but it makes sense from an ecological point of view because those plants that are variegated don't have as many of those chemical compounds that deter species. So from a caterpillar's point of view, they're like, oh man, I gotta feed on this. But they also don't have as much chlorophyll. And so we didn't study how fast they were growing, but we suspect that that those caterpillars probably grew slower. But in general, it wasn't really clear that variegated plants were better or worse. The only trait that it was cared for was those red leaf cultivars.
Okay. Did less chickadees or fewer chickadees live after being counted as eggs in the non-native predominant areas?
Is the question about were fewer of the nestlings surviving?
Correct.
I think. Okay. Yeah. So that's a good question. So yeah, that's why we were seeing the declines. So for this particular species, they lay a lot of eggs. It's between 4 to 10 eggs. They're a little bird, and it's not surprising that not all of those nestlings will survive. Sometimes there's runts, you know, they just don't get enough food. That's not to be expected, or that's not surprising. But what we were seeing is that more of the nestlings were not surviving in the non-native yards, and we had some follow-up work to actually look at the food items that they were bringing, and we found that those chickadees were bringing lower quality food items. So food that's smaller, that have lower calories, things like that. And so, and for the birds that are in the native yards, most of the young were surviving. And so that's why we looked at those different stages, so that we wanted to identify what stage that these negative effects were occurring on. And what we found out is that what we were seeing was actually minor effects at every stage that compounded into a large effect overall.
All right, very, very interesting. We only have time for one last question as we are nearing the end of our time. You mentioned the Native Plant Finder. Does that resource also indicate species that would support the migratory birds that you mentioned that need support?
Oh, I love that you asked that question. I love that that's the last question. So we are suggesting that this might be a good proxy for bird habitat. But we need to test this further. And I'm literally actually, as we speak, putting in a proposal to try to get money to look at exactly that question of whether whether prioritizing the productive plant species to improve habitat for migratory birds. We know from people that have studied migratory birds in intact natural forests that they prioritize particular plants. So they like oaks, they like elms, they like cherries, they like willows. We know that already. And so what I want to do is study that in an urban system to see if we see those same patterns that we observed in the Chickadees. I highly suspect that we will, based on my anecdotal data. But at the moment, the Native Plant Finder only talks about the caterpillars, and it doesn't say anything about the birds. But we're working on that. It's a work in progress.
Okay, well, we will hope to hear more about your research once you conclude that next project, and we'll learn what we can do to support the migratory birds.
Great.
So, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Narango, for sharing this unique glimpse into these important plant and chickadee interactions. It's really been fascinating and will surely inspire all of us to consider the birds when making our plant selections.